So my name's Sanita. I was originally born in Leicester, but I have Indian descent. And I was a victim of domestic violence, but I've gone from PTSD, psychologically damaged, to now surviving and actually thriving. So I want to tell you a little bit about my story. And I guess it all starts, everything, it all starts from childhood, right? So I'm going to take you back to me as a child in Leicester and witnessing my mum go through a hell of a lot of abuse. And what I saw is my mum was actually born in the UK, but obviously also was originally from India. And what I saw was in our culture, in this Indian, Asian culture, that abuse was okay. Abuse was normalized. So as a very young child, as a super young child, what I saw was my mum experiencing physical abuse, economical abuse, psychological and emotional abuse. And one of the stories that is etched in my mind forever is I remember my mum had finally been brave enough to give my dad the boot because of all the abuse. So he was no longer living with us, and it was only on a temporary basis. And we were all in my mum's bed. There was me, my two sisters. I have an older sister and a younger sister. We were very young. We were all under the age of 10. And we were all in my mum's bed, just having Saturday morning cuddles. And we heard this banging outside. We heard this banging and we wasn't sure what it was. So my mum went to go check it out. And what we found was it was my dad. And he was prepared. He had steel toe cap boots on, and he was literally smashing our front door in, the front door to our house. And obviously at the time, we were just young kids. We didn't know what to do. And my mum was also young herself because she had us young, and she was married off young in an arranged marriage. So that was not her choice. And what we found was my mum was trying to hold this door together whilst my dad was literally kicking it in. And obviously trying to avoid the inevitable. But the inevitable happened. And that was my dad had managed to get into the house because he'd actually, this was inner city Leicester. A terraced house, very inexpensive door. It probably wouldn't have taken a lot to get through anyway, but he managed to get through. And he'd actually physically kicked a hole in the bottom of the front door and had got in. And it was absolute carnage. So there was GBH against my mom, my sisters. I was so scared. I was born an introvert. You wouldn't think it now. And I did what I knew best, which was when stuff goes wrong, you run upstairs and you hide under your bed, right? So that's what I did. And little did I know, my dad had gone to go and get a kitchen knife. And so I was upstairs hiding, just, I don't know, probably too young to have a panic attack, but obviously going through distress. My mum was downstairs, my two sisters were downstairs, and my dad had actually gone to go get a knife. And basically he went to go and obviously finish the job because he wasn't happy with my mum being separated away from him, because obviously it took his power and control away from him. So I was upstairs. When I heard things had calmed down, I came downstairs and everyone had gone. It was all quiet. And so as a young child, I must have been about 7 at the time, about 7 or 8, I literally ran to the bathroom because as a young kid, that was literally the only room in the house that had a lock on it. So I thought my mum probably would have gone to the bathroom and locked the door because she would have been safe there, and there was no one in the bathroom. So I was like, well, where have they gone? Where's my sisters? Where's my mum? Where's my dad? And so I remember crawling through the hole that had been made by my dad in the front door and going outside, and I saw my dad there. and he had his back to me. And then I saw my neighbour, and my neighbour said, quick, get in the house. So she quickly let me in my house, and just as I just got into her house, my dad turned round. And so he didn't realise I was still in the house. And if he did, I wouldn't be here today telling my story. And my mum actually wailed when she saw me, because my mum spent, I don't know how long it was, because I can't give you a time frame, because time just wasn't in my mind at that time. But my mum, for some period of time, whether it be 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour, thought that I was dead. And she wailed. She literally, I've never heard my mum like that before. And she held me so tight, and I was like, what, why are you like this? And she goes, and she whispered in my ear, I thought he'd killed you. So my mum thought for that period of time that I was gone, because I didn't know he'd gone to get a knife. And long story short, with that particular situation was my dad did go to prison, not for that long, only for a few months. And you would have thought it would have been longer, attempted murder, GBH, breaking and entering, but apparently it was only a few months that he required in prison. So that's where my childhood started. That's just the childhood, because everything starts from childhood. And we grew up, and I went on to be as successful as I could be in the working world. I went off to university, and for me and my sisters, we just carried on like everything was okay. We wasn't actually given any support. There was no mental health support services, no counselling, no therapy, just a social worker who asked if we wanted to stay with our mum, if we wanted to see our dad, and that was pretty much it. And I actually never saw my dad after that. His choice. He actually had a choice to come and see us after he left prison, and he chose not to. So that was his choice. And so then I went off to university. I actually got my first boyfriend at university, and I was actually quite happy about that, because at school no one was ever really interested in me. And what I didn't know was my first boyfriend was actually abusive, and I had no idea until recently, until I ended up in another abusive relationship. So in this first relationship that I had, there was excessive amounts of jealousy, and I would be controlled as to where I would go, and he would just be very needy, always wanting me to be around him all the time. And we'd never come across abusive. You would never think it, because he was more of a, I guess, the actual official term is a covert narcissist, where they come across very needy, depressed, sad, but not actually looking like a very alpha male, abusive male, if that makes sense. So he wormed his way in, manipulated my thoughts, clouded my judgments all the time. And so I didn't even realize it was abuse. I couldn't see the games he was playing. I was so blinded to it, or I just couldn't see it. And eventually I was strong enough to leave him. But I had no idea it was abuse. I didn't do all the healing that I needed to do. So I went on, carried on, spent my time just trying to work on me, threw myself into the gym, that kind of thing. And I loved myself. I did. But not fully. That was the problem. I loved myself, but I hadn't fully loved myself. And because I hadn't done that extra tiny bit of work of fully accepting me for who I was, I still had a mask. I still was trying to be perfect, still trying to be someone else rather than being me. And so what happened was I got swept off my feet. I got swept off my feet, and I found this amazing guy, and he literally told me I deserved to be loved. And I guess part of the problem here is part of me was lonely. Part of me was lonely. I hadn't fully accepted myself, and I wasn't fully comfortable with being alone with myself. So I was lonely. So when the first nice guy came along, of course I was gonna fall into his arms. There's no doubt about it. It was inevitable, right? Because I was lonely. And there's this nice man who wants to show me the world, tells me that I deserve the world, and obviously I was completely unaware that this is what we call love bombing. So completely was romantic, overly romantic, grand gestures, all of this stuff. He was basically getting my trust. And he got my trust all right. And so I was there. I was his. And so before you knew it, within a couple of weeks, he'd introduced me to his family. And I was just like, wow, this is moving fast. This is moving really fast, and I wasn't fully comfortable with it. But I also thought, I know where I stand with this man. I know where I stand, and so I want to go with this. So I went with it, and he proposed to me a few months later, and I was just like, wow, life is too good to be true right now, right? Life is just amazing. His family were amazing. They were all super nice to me. My family accepted him. There was literally nothing that could go wrong. His mum adored me like I was, her own daughter. And, that's not quite so common in Asian families, right? Evil mother-in-law and all of that. So I felt really lucky, and I felt super, super grateful. And, I agreed to getting married to him, although I didn't want to get married to him immediately. I wanted to wait. So I wanted to get married in a couple of years. But then the cavalry showed up. And, his auntie showed up, his family showed up at the house and was like, no, you need to get married this year. And I was like, okay. I was like, well, they're obviously keen because he's the last one to get married in his family of this generation. So I agreed to getting married that year, although I wasn't entirely comfortable with it because I had a lot of stuff going on. I had a hell of a lot of stuff going on. So for me, I was working full-time in a very high-pressure job. I also had exams going on part-time. So I was working full-time, studying part-time. I then got headhunted for another job whilst organising a wedding, whilst moving house. There was a hell of a lot of stuff going on. It was incredibly stressful. So can you imagine when you're trying to spin all these 20 plates that you're not watching what they're doing? So what he was doing was emotionally, psychologically manipulating me, and I could not see it because I was just trying to keep the plates in the air. I was just trying to keep the plates in the air, just trying to keep doing what I was doing. And obviously we bought a house together, and that's kind of when I started to see the flaws in the mother-in-law. She started to let slip with a few certain things. And I guess a couple of stories that I can tell you are this: abuse doesn't just happen straight away. They're not going to slap the drink out of your hand on the first date. They're not going to do that because they're not that stupid. These abusers, these perpetrators are incredibly skilled at being charming. They're incredibly skilled at being persuasive. They actually get a lot of partners. They actually get a lot of romantic partners because they're so skilled in being persuasive and romantic and being amazing at love bombing, being overly romantic. But obviously that can only last so long because it's quite exhausting, right? So after they get you to a certain level where you trust them and they've got you into the family, all of that stuff, then they drop you, just like that. And that's when they particularly choose empathetic women who love to please. That's me, empathetic, and I love to please. So what happens is we then will do anything to get that love and attention back. anything to get some of that, our emotional needs met, right? So this is basically what happened. And so I was doing anything to try and please him. And he was loving this because there was no finish line. It was a system designed to fail because the expectations were so unrealistic, completely unrealistic. So for me, I was in this house. I was actually being emotionally abused by my mother-in-law as well as my husband. So you might want to know what happened, what were the examples. So before the wedding, yes, there was a couple of signs. Was it enough for me to say, I can't marry him? No, not that I could see anyway. So for example, he did this thing that you can Google, the official term is stonewalling. And what that means is he would emotionally shut me out. And it would be like torture for me, like for days, for weeks. And we would live in the same house. This would happen for weeks. I would try and message. I wouldn't know when he was coming home, if he was coming home. And he would travel all over Europe for work, so I would have no idea if he was coming home that day or even that week. And so I wouldn't be allowed to ask. I wouldn't be allowed to know. And if I did try and ask, my phone calls would be cut off. My messages would be blanked. If I tried to, and this is the thing, me being me, I would go and let me just give him a hug. He can't be mad at me if I give him a hug, right? So then I'd go and give him a hug, and he would physically push me away so hard. You can't see right now, but I'm 5'4", so I'm not that tall. He would push me so hard that I would literally end up on the floor. But what would I say to myself? I would say he doesn't know his own strength. I would defend him. He doesn't know his own strength, it's okay. We would be in bed and I'd think, oh, let me just give him a hug. Because you get told, don't go to bed on an argument, right? That's the advice we had in our wedding cards. So I was like, let me give him a hug in bed. And he can't be mad at me. He's just going to give me a hug back. No. He would physically kick me off him. Physically kick me off him. And obviously by learnt behaviour, you learn, don't go near him when he's mad. Because, he needs to calm down. So I learned that it was my fault. Because the way he would gaslight and manipulate me it was my fault. Because I shouldn't have approached him when he was angry. So, and then when you're in a position where you've got someone manipulating your thoughts, your judgments, clouding everything, even brainwashing you to a certain extent. And it's not just one person. You've got the family involved as well. So you have a family of enablers. His family were all enabling and advocating his abuse. So they were almost telling me that I was the crazy one and what he was doing was correct because he's always done it. So that's what made me actually stay in the relationship a little bit longer, because I was like, what? Is it me? Is it him? Is it normal? Is it not? Kind of thing. So there was a lot of things that happened, but I'll give you an example. So other than the stonewalling, his mum used to do that to me as well. And I did wonder, did she learn it from him or did he learn it from her? Because you did start to wonder, who learned it from who? And actually, what I actually witnessed was he had actually abused his mom as well on emotional and psychological levels. So she had just learned to use the same tactics back. But she didn't want to do it. I could see she didn't want to do it. But it was the only way that she knew. It'd become normalized to her. So whereas with him, he did it intentionally to punish. So people say, do they actually know what they're doing? Well, of course they do. So why would they play these mind games? Why would they psychologically want to punish you if they didn't know what they were doing? So anyway, moving on. Another example of kind of something that happened, we just bought this house, we were renovating it. I was sat on this tiny stool, literally this big. I was this far off the ground. And I had a mask on, not because of COVID, this is before COVID, gloves on, and I was painting, and I'm in a completely separate room. And this guy came out of nowhere. And I had already injured my wrist. He came out of nowhere, literally stood over me. I was sat on this tiny stool, and he literally stood over me, and I looked over at him, and then he reached down, grabbed my wrist that was already injured. I couldn't do anything with this wrist because it was already, you could physically see it was hurt. And he just squeezed it and didn't let go. And I was in shock because I was like, firstly, I'm in a separate room. Like, why are you coming all the way here just to grab my already injured wrist, which he knew about? And so what would you do? Well, naturally you go into shock, right? And I told him to get off because he was hurting me. So eventually he let go. And I just cried, and I went to just go up the stairs and cry. And then you'd think at that point he would be like, why are you crying? Or why are you upset? And he basically then continued by swearing at me, literally swearing at me for crying. And I was like, what is going on? And then literally, it was timed so well. 5 minutes after that, I heard the door shut, because obviously I lived with the mother-in-law. It's one of the rules, right? It was part of the package. So the mother-in-law walks in, and I went downstairs and I told her everything. And she just went off to a room like nothing had happened. And I'm just thinking to myself, your son has intentionally physically hurt me for no reason. It's not like we were play fighting or anything. He's come out of a separate room to come and physically, intentionally hurt me. Nothing. That is a warning sign right there. And I couldn't see that. And I was just like, what is going on? And so I was like, okay, he's just angry because he had a little bit of trauma. He had like this much of his finger amputated. So I thought, oh, okay, maybe he's just angry about that. You know, he's not dealing with his feelings very well. So I'll forgive him. You know, I'm married to him. I need to, through the good days, the bad days is marriage, right? You know, you don't just give up just because someone is hurting on the inside. But then it happened again and again and again. And that's when I realised it had nothing to do with his finger. It was him. It was actually him. And so that was just one example. But there's several examples of abuse. But I think the biggest one which I couldn't talk about was the sexual abuse. So you don't expect it. I mean, when someone hears sexual abuse, you think, oh, you get that as a child when you're defenseless, when you're young, when you don't know any better. You don't expect to hear an adult talking about sexual abuse. But majority of my abuse was emotional, psychological, and sexual. There was obviously elements of physical abuse involved, but majority was those three things. And so for me, there was times when I would just literally be poked and prodded and woken up at 4 a.m, even on the day after our wedding day as well. He did this, which I thought was hilarious. He would just wake me up whenever he wanted it. He would have it because it was this male entitlement. He was actually called the king in the house. He was literally called the king. Like, I can laugh about it now, but at the time it was not that funny. But yeah, so the sexual abuse, various different ways. So sex pest, I would call it, where he would wake me up in the middle of the night when he wanted it. And sometimes, I mean, I'm a deep sleeper, and I would wake up and he would just be on top of me. So sex pest, or sleep rapist, whatever you want to call it, right? And that took probably 12 weeks of therapy for me to actually admit that my own husband had raped me. Because, you know, you think, how does a husband rape you? Well, when you're asleep and you say no and they carry on. That's how a husband rapes you. Or when they call you a slag. Yeah, they call you a slag, completely unprovoked, because they don't want you to post on social media. They don't like that you're becoming secure with yourself. So they call you a slag. My whole world fell apart. My own husband called me a slag. Like, how how can you breathe after that? Your own husband called you a slag. So my whole world fell apart. And we were in bed. He called me that it was Sunday morning. He said that to me. I was basically trying to talk about my feelings, and I thought, if I tell him in bed, he can't run away, right? So my thinking was, if I tell him in bed he can't run away, he'll have to listen to me, he'll have to hear me out. But I was very tactful. I spoke softly, didn't raise my voice, because I know, I was treading on eggshells here. I know what he was like. I didn't expect him to then call me a slag and then rape me. Yeah. So there was a lot of sexual abuse involved, and you might think, well, how did that happen? Did you not say no? Did you not push him off? Yes, I did. So I was distraught. I was crying my eyes out. Do you know when you're crying so much that you can't breathe, and you're like that when you're a kid, right? Yeah, that was me. I was literally crying like that. I was just like this, and I just rolled over in the bed, and I just wanted the world to swallow me up because of what he just said, and I actually couldn't believe it. I was in shock, to be honest. And then I just wanted him. I was literally saying, just give me a hug and tell me you didn't mean it. Just give me a hug and say you really regret saying that. It just came out in a bad moment, right? Just tell. That's what was going through my head. And then he came over, and I was like, yes, thank you, God. He's coming over to say sorry. No. He started touching me. And yeah, he got what he wanted. I said no. I actually couldn't even talk because I was crying that much, and I was saying, I can't. And he carried on. I physically tried to push him off, but like I said, I'm 5'4". This guy was over 6 foot. So he was much bigger and stronger than me. And he continued to get what he wanted. So yeah, and then I thought that was the worst part, but actually it was afterwards when he actually had a go at me for not orgasming. Yeah. So that's just some examples of sexual abuse. I mean, just saying that, I mean, it wasn't all, forced. And it's difficult because as a wife, there are times when you do want to, have that time with your partner, but it's when it's forced. It's when when you're being manipulated. I mean, I remember there were times where I was guilt tripped. I'd been away on a work trip because I did a lot of work traveling, and I'd been away to Scotland for 2 days. And I remember coming back and I was tired. My flight had been delayed. I mean, I know it was not a long flight and I hadn't gone far, but still, I was tired. I'd done back-to-back 12-hour days at work, and I said no. And the ramifications that would happen from saying no. It was insane. He would guilt trip me. He actually would say, this is one of his common things that he would do, was he would say, I shouldn't repeat it. Actually, I can't repeat it. But he would say some horrific things, refer to me being someone who slept around in the past with, X amount of people, and would just guilt trip me that I was not providing as a partner for him. And so out of guilt, I would feel like, oh my God, I'm not being the best partner. So I should, even though I was either in pain or I didn't want to or I was tired. But that's just some examples of sexual abuse. It doesn't always necessarily mean that you were physically forced. You can be emotionally coerced into it as well. So I just want to make that clear. So that's just obviously some examples. But I think the biggest part is when the family are advocates. So for me, I probably would have left a hell of a lot sooner if I listened to my own judgments and wasn't clouded, if it was just me versus an abuser or a perpetrator. But what I had was I was literally surrounded around me by his family who were all advocating his abuse. And so for me, I was in a situation where I would call his sister crying my eyes out, hysterically saying, I can't do this anymore. I'm going to have to get a divorce. Can you please help me? And I mean, she kind of tried. I mean, she did a courtesy phone call, but the issue was she was also being abused by him. So his whole family were extensions of his abuse. His whole family. And so his mom was too scared, and I would literally beg his mom to speak to him. But then what I realized was his mom had never been an authority figure in his life. So of course, even if she did stand up to me, he wasn't going to listen to her because he'd never listened to her whole life. And then with his sister, she was also scared. In fact, I remember a situation when he had his finger, only literally that much of his finger amputated. Obviously, it hurt his ego, being a narcissist. And his sister had made a joke. And you know, these perpetrators are very sensitive, highly sensitive people. So that joke, it hurt him. What we would call narcissistic injury, right? So he stonewalled his sister because he didn't want to speak to his sister. He was punishing her. He was actually punishing her, and she had no idea. But I could see what he was doing. And I was actually really grateful. I know this sounds so bad, but I was so grateful that it wasn't me. That it wasn't me on the receiving end. That actually I was, I was the one that he was talking to, and I was just like, this is great. But I also felt guilty for his sister because she was receiving this. And so what would happen is I was caught up in the middle of this. She would actually call me trying to get through to him. She would even utilize her children to try she was almost kind of emotionally trying to get through to him using her children. And he would still refuse to take the call, even when she would call me and ask me to pass the phone over. So sometimes the family are extensions of the abuse, whether they realize it or not. So just to make that clear. But yeah, so just there's a lot of examples. I'll probably be here all day if I told you everything, but I'm just trying to give you the highlight reel, if that makes sense. So one last example that I'll tell you about is basically when things had got really bad. He'd become unpredictable. He wasn't actually unpredictable, but he wanted me to feel like he was unpredictable so he could keep me under his control, right? So I was very scared, and I actually managed to use his drill to put a lock on my door. And because I was so scared, I couldn't sleep at night. I didn't know when he was coming home, if he was going to come home, if he was going to sexually assault me. I had no idea what was going to go on. So I put a lock on my door for my safety so I could sleep. I informed his mum. I said, if he tries to force his way into my room, I'll call the police. And she did nothing. She actually just acted like I'd asked her to do the washing up. It was like a no reaction, which I thought was weird. So it was almost normalized for her. And then his sister, I called his sister, crying my eyes out again. You'd think there'd be some form of reaction by now, but no. And her concern for me putting a lock on the door was, well, why did I move some of his clothes into the spare room? I had chest pain. I was struggling. I literally had anxiety constantly, that my chest was constantly in pain. And I told her this, and I said, I can't cope. And her concern was I'd moved his clothes into the spare room. So that just goes to show how families can advocate abuse. So shortly after that, I did finally leave because she actually was a stimulus to me realizing that I am the only one that can look after me. And I was the only one that was going to care for my well-being. And that's my message to you is you are the only person that can care for your well-being. If these perpetrators could change, they wouldn't have multiple victims. So how did I get from PTSD, constantly locking doors, constantly locking windows, to now being thriving, to doing interviews like this, to, having my own business and having all these amazing things in my life? Well, it went on a journey of loving myself, actually fully loving myself. And when you get to that point when you're happy to spend time with you, when you fully know yourself, when you know your strengths, you know your weaknesses, you know you inside out, that is when self-worth is born. And that's exactly what I want for you. Regardless whether you've been through abuse or not, regardless whether you relate to this Indian culture of advocating abuse, it doesn't matter. Because the majority of women actually lack self-worth. And that's what I'm all about. I'm here to help women understand that if you know your worth, you're not going to accept these substandard relationships. You're not going to accept the substandard job that you're in right now. You're going to go after what you're worth. And that is why I'm here to tell you to go after what you're worth, to know you, to know what you're worth, to know what you're absolutely capable of achieving. And that's what I'm here to do today, is to firstly educate you on what abuse is, not to rehash the story, because we're not victims. We are survivors. So that is what I'm here to do today, is to help educate, but then also help you understand that if you love you, no one can ever do this to you. No one can ever do this to you again. And that's what I want to share with you today. So I just want to say thank you so much for having me here, for listening to my story, and I would ask you to share this. And the reason why I'd ask you to share this is because that friend that you think has the most perfect life, she has a mask on too. And her life might not be that perfect. And she might need you to share this. She might need to hear this story. So what I ask for you today, that doesn't cost you anything, is for you to share my story with the world. Thank you.